We're here to answer the question, how to make baked French onion soup. Now, baked French onion soup is a classic, of course, from France that's well known throughout the world and is made in multiple English and non-English speaking countries as a great soup. You can go to great restaurants all over Paris today still, and they're still serving baked French onion soup because it's so good. Now, most of the deviations or the changes or small modifications that an individual chef makes on a French onion soup in terms of French people is fairly small. Now, Americans will make all kinds of changes and they'll take it so far away from being French onion soup you can't even recognize it sometimes. But we're not going to do that today. We're going to give you a really authentic, close French version of how the soup is made, okay? Basically, French onion soup consists of onions that have been glazed, and you will see that this process for glazing the onions also meets the requirements for all glazed onion recipes. Recipes meaning that call for glazed onions in the ingredients. Some people call them caramelized onions. Some people, basically they're called glazed onions in French cooking. And the sugar in the onions is released from the onion and is caramelized excuse me, in the pan that you're cooking the onions in. And normally the onions are glazed over a fairly long period of time. But because we're only going to be using 3 onions for the amount of soup that we're going to make today, the time is not going to be that long. But typically the onions are sliced in a specific way, which I'm going to show you how onions are sliced when any recipe calls for sliced onions, which is not in a circular pattern of the onion. For example, if I cut an onion like this, it's in a circle because I end up with circles, okay? This is not, okay? Cutting the onion that way, where you end up with circles, is not the definition of sliced onion as a rule in any ingredient list of a recipe. Sliced onions refers to onion being cut in half, laid on its side, now you'll notice that I turned, after I sliced a certain amount of the onion, I turned it again. Watch. Gets too small to hold right there now, so now I turn it again like that to finish slicing it. Now that would be considered sliced onions for French onion soup. So we're going to quickly slice there's 3 onions, and to keep something in mind, you may start out with a lot of onions, but you'll end up with a very small amount because there's a lot of water in the onion, and it will condense probably to 20% of the original size, okay? These onions are decent sized onions. We may go with 2½ onions. We'll go with all 3. If you think we have too much onions, we'll take some of the glazed onions out and use them for something else later. 3 onions is probably the perfect amount, though. Time to create a new sweat towel for John. Okay. All right, now we're going to heat up our pan, and we're going to put a little bit of whole unsalted butter or clarified butter, whichever you want, and we're going to put all of the onions inside this pan. I'm going to start the temperature out on the flame a little medium to high, but as soon as it starts cooking, it gets hot, we're going to turn it down. Now this is going to get salt and pepper. Pepper, and there's your salt, and we're going to put a little bit of dried leaf thyme on the onions. This is an absolute necessary ingredient for French onion soup, that you put thyme on the onions, fresh or dried, either one. And we're going to let that cook. And as it starts to brown, we're going to time-elapse the cooking of the onions, of course, for you. You'll kind of use up the liquid moisture from the butter in a short period of time. And at that point right there is when you add a little bit of water to the onions and you cover them up and put them at a low temperature, which is what we're going to do. So we're going to time-elapse the browning of the onions. I'll be back in about 3 to 5 minutes, and they'll be like partially browned, and then we'll complete the process of setting the onions up for glazing for a long period of cooking, and then we'll have to time-elapse that. Then we'll come back and make the soup when we finish making the glazed onions. So we'll be back 5 minutes right now. Okay, the onions have been cooking for about 7 or 8 minutes. And let me take a little peek at them with you. You see how they're slightly brown, starting to brown a little bit. I added a little bit more butter to the pan because the pan needed a little bit more butter to cook the onions. Okay, now the glazing of the onion process is going to include putting a small amount of water, and don't worry about how much you're putting. I don't put an excessive amount on there. You may have to add more water as you go along. Now you can glaze these onions on top of the stove if you want, or inside the oven. If you do them on top of the stove, which is what we're going to do, you take your flame. Can you zoom in on this flame here, Richard? You get your flame down very low, way low, so you can, it's barely on. Okay, come on back up. So this is almost as low as it possibly can be, okay? You want to cook the onions slowly. Then you put a sealed lid on it, and you let it cook. And every once in a while, you can go over there and check it and see if it's dehydrating a little bit. And if it does, add a little bit of water to it. Just add enough water and keep enough water in your onions about to glaze pot to keep them moist and not sticking. You know, you don't want to burn them. They will brown automatically later as the sugar in the onions is released and it caramelizes in the pan. So for right now, we're just making glazed onions, or caramelized onions, if you will, that we're going to use in a French onion soup. So this is going to take about an hour, give or take. And so we're going to time-elapse this and shoot it forward, then I'll tell you how long it took. And I'll babysit the onions and add a little water to them from time to time if I need to, okay? So I'll be right back. The glazed onions, or the caramelized onions for the onion soup, which have been cooking and caramelizing and glazing for approximately 45 minutes since we left you there. Let's take a peek at them and you will see just how wonderful they look now. And you see how nice and brown they are? That's what happens when you cook them and you cook them and you cook them. A little bit of butter, a little bit of water. Now some people will add a little bit of sugar to the onions. That's because they're concerned that the soup itself or the onions may not have the amount of sugar necessary in it that can be released during the cooking process and be caramelized, the sugar that is, in the pan, and then change the color and the flavor of the onions, which is what the caramelized sugar does. That's why they're called caramelized onions or glazed onions. But anyway, sometimes people will put sugar in them. The onions aren't sweet enough. These onions are sweet enough. Evidently, I put no sugar in them. Now for the continuing process of making French onion soup from the glazed onions. Begins with a little bit of garlic, not much. This is not a big garlic consuming soup. I put a tablespoon and a half in there. I'm going to turn this up just a touch. Now the traditional way in which onion soup is thickened, if you will, although that's not the right word because it really doesn't get that thick, is flour, all-purpose flour, is mixed right over the onions. Like that, you see? You just have the flour, and you just mix the flour into the onion, like that. And that's how onion soup is, quote, tightened up, if you will, which is the slang term, or cooking term, for thickening something, all right? So there's your flour. And now we have some brown veal stock, and you can use brown beef stock also. And we're going to thin these onions out with that. Now we're going to let that simmer